Hey, Konstantin, good to see you.
Good to see you, Stephen. How are you, my friend?
Good man, you?
Yeah, very good. I've been away for a couple of weeks over Christmas, so I'm recovered and ready to roll for
Fresh,
2023.
ready to go, get stuck in with the culture wars and all things raging progressives, I suppose. Which brings me nicely onto Jordan Peterson. I know you've wrote about him recently on your
Mhm.
Substack. He's been in the news because of some sort of retraining program he's been put through in regards to his social media output. Just to like put where I am on Jordan Peterson, I have sort of mixed views on the man. I love some of his stuff. I scratch my head at other things. But I do feel that some of his most vocal critics are completely untethered from reality. So maybe you can just explain to us a little bit about what's going on with Jordan Peterson at the minute and what is why is this happening to somebody like him?
Well, it's happening because they're trying to get him to behave, quote unquote, on social media. And by behave, I mean by, not say what he thinks, comply with whatever requirements that they have. And they're basically threatening to take away his license as a practicing psychologist unless he does this mandatory course, a mandatory re-education course in how to behave on social media. And so he's obviously refusing. And it's interesting to me, someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, how Soviet this feels, like the re-education. I mean, people from China likewise would be familiar with with this approach. But the piece I wrote on Substack is something I've been thinking about for a long time, which is why, as you say, Jordan is not perfect. Like every person, he's got his strengths, his weaknesses. Some of his message, I think, is very valuable. Other people, he's strayed into perhaps things outside of his area of expertise of late, and people rightly, I think, criticize him for that. But the thing I've been thinking about for many years now is why did he get such a visceral reaction from some quarters? What is it about him? And I think it's inevitable if you look at the way that the questions he was asked when he first became well known. It was always about, you know, you're mostly watched by men, and there was this sort of implication that this is bad. Some a product being consumed more by men than women is automatically bad. When no one will criticize a makeup company for selling more makeup to women than men. Um, and I think fundamentally at the core of it is there are some people in society now who just don't want men to be better. And anyone who comes along and says, this is how men should be, this is how men should behave, this is how men should conduct themselves in order to be stronger, more confident, whatever, that person immediately finds themselves in the firing line. Because I don't know if you saw, there was this clip of a girl from Reason UK going around London asking people on the street, what are women good for, and what are men good for? And it's fascinating because if you walk up to anyone in London and you say, "What are women good for?" They'll say everything, or they'll rail off a list as long as your arm. The moment she asked them as a follow up, "What are men good for?" they all sort of just clammed up and couldn't say anything. And so I think that I think is quite a strong factor in how Jordan Peterson is being treated, which is why I wrote the piece about it, kind of talking about the fact that I think we've got to a point where there's quite a strong movement now to just say, we don't want men to improve, we don't want men to be good, we don't want men to be strong, we don't want men to be confident.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and I think you've touched on something there in the sense that I think maybe where he became sort of persona non grata in the eyes of the progressive left was when he started pointing out the obvious differences between men and women. Obviously, accepting that men and women are equal under the law, but there are differences. And I seem to feel like on the progressive left, there's this idea that if we just pretend something's true, it'll improve reality. So if they pretend, for instance, that all differences between men and women are due to socialization or the patriarchy,
Mm.
things like that, then they can eliminate those things and make everything equal. But that's just not the case, is it? Is this what's got him into the most trouble, do you think? His views on gender and sex?
Yeah, I think that, and trans, obviously, which is a big hot button issue as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because I think that there are other role models that men have flocked to in recent weeks and months and years that are perhaps less constructive than Jordan. And I find it interesting that he would be attacked because he didn't really have a toxic message. He wasn't. He's not Andrew Tate exactly, right? He was just there saying this is how men and women, but his message resonated more with men, I think. men should conduct themselves in order to be happier, to be more fulfilled, to be more productive, to contribute more to their families and societies. I would have thought that any society that wishes to have, a health, wishes to be healthy, would want that to happen. But as I say, I think what's got him in trouble partly is that constructive approach, in that people don't want that to be the message that people hear in our society for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of masculinity is an interesting one because I see that a large proportion of his audience are young men of a certain age, and it feels to me like they're looking for guidance. And like you say, it's good that they are latching onto someone like Jordan Peterson, who's a key message appears to be, if you want to do well, you need to improve yourself and take responsibility. But is there some sort of crisis of masculinity here, where young men are looking for some sort of guidance or a way out of some of the things that are occurring in society at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't like describing things as a crisis, but what I do think is, obviously, over the last 6 decades, you've got a progressive breakdown of the family, where fewer and fewer boys are growing up with dads. And in a society where you have that, and a society, that's made, rightly made sure that women are not being mistreated and discriminated against and so on, sometimes you can get to a position where that carries on past its original remit, and you end up in a position where actually boys and men are doing worse. In that sort of society, I think boys and men will always look for role models, as they would anyway. I mean, boys and girls need role models, right? And so the interesting thing to me is that it's almost like you're the first person I've ever really heard ask that question, because most of the time someone comes along who acts as a role model for young men, and they're automatically attacked. No one actually goes, well, why is it that lots of young men are looking for a role
Mm.
model on their phone as opposed to in their own lives? And that, I think, is where a lot of the answer to this is. It's like, dads are important, and the fact that more and more kids are growing up without dads active in their lives is going to cause a lot of trouble. It's already causing that. And I think that's one of the reasons that people end up looking for sort of substitutes online. I mean, a friend of mine, she always joked about this, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think the point is somewhat valid. She said, I'm not into Jordan Peterson because I had a dad. And I think that's kind of like a lot of the gaps that he fills, are gaps that in most people's lives should have been filled by their father.
Yeah, I think I facetiously wrote that I'm not really moved by him because my dad once told me he's proud of me. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, like I say, it is a bit facetious, but there might be something to that. But I think what concerns me as well, and Jordan Peters is definitely, I mean, there's many other figures that fit this mold, but in terms of how the debate is not won anymore on conversation and discussion and weighing ideas against each other, but rather misrepresenting people, creating a caricature. So if I was to have my mind wiped and then to log onto the internet tomorrow and search for Jordan Peterson, I could either be led into thinking he's some alt-right neo-Nazi white supremacist, or I could believe that he's some amazing guru that has all the answers and is going to revolutionize Western thought. So, I mean, how do we navigate these waters now? How important is it really to instill a sort of critical mindset into people when trying to make up the mind?
Well, I don't know that we're going to be able to do that particularly, but I think that the answer is quite obvious, which is you listen to what he actually says
Hmm.
for yourself, and then you make up your own mind. And by the way, one of the things I should add as well is, I actually don't believe that, even though I think these problems exist, I actually don't believe that the solution is for men to embrace some of the approaches that have been used by other groups in recent years, which is to whine and complain about how discriminated you are. I think the answer is actually what Jordan Peterson is talking about, which is to be better. It's the answer that's always been the case for men. Young men need to realize that no one's going to give you anything. No one's coming to save you. Society isn't going to reorder itself around your needs. And by the way, biologically speaking, men are less important than women from a reproductive point of view. That's why they're considered less valuable to a society. It's obvious, if you have a tribe of 10 men, 10 women, right? You lose 9 men, you can still reproduce at the same rate. If you lose half the women, you're going to struggle. So men are going always to be treated as somewhat less valuable in those situations, particularly in a society that doesn't have to go to war and so on and so forth. But the answer for men is to be better, is to improve their skills, to improve their qualifications, is to improve their confidence, is to do things that make them healthier and more successful. Because you're not going to whine your way into anything as a man. you know, you might be able to, as other groups, they've been quite successful at that, but it's not going to happen for men. So I think that's kind of why I think Jordan Peterson is different to some of the other people that are doing what he's done to some extent. Is he's actually offering people a constructive way out, which is why I feel so strongly that the attacks on him are unfair. And you know, I think they reveal a lot about the ideology behind progressivism and their view of the ideal society in which you know, men that don't have any confidence or power or strength or anything, because men are toxic, dangerous, and whatever, in inverted commas.
Well, just to segue nicely into the potential of toxic men, you referenced Andrew Tate at the start of this conversation in contrast. Now, I don't know an awful lot about him, but I have heard newsreaders read out things he said. And it sounds awful, but I assume that it could possibly be designed to sound that way as well. And given how I know people can be misrepresented, is he as bad as people are saying in your view? Have you looked into this in any great detail?
I haven't looked into it too much. We actually invited him on Trigonometry, and he said he would come on, but then he got some allegations against him that are now being investigated. So
Oh yeah,
I
hadn't
don't,
heard.
I don't know if that will happen. The truth is, I don't know a huge amount about him. As like you say, I've heard some of the stuff that he said. I think you know, Andrew Tate is a teenager's idea of a male role model. You know,
Perfect.
I think that's what he is. And it'd be interesting to have the conversation with him and discuss, but that's kind of what I see from the outside, because a guy who says that a dad should only be around once a month or once a year or whatever he is, I don't think he really understands fatherhood or parenthood or anything like that. But he's very good at, you know, promoting himself online. And I think this is, you know, irrespective, I don't really like to get into personalities, particularly people that I don't know, but I think the fact that figures like him and Milo Yiannopoulos before him, these brash, overly confident, exuberant individuals are coming through and being making huge waves, whether you like them personally or not. I think it's a reflection of the hunger that is there for people to challenge some of these orthodoxies that exist in relation to, like you said, gender roles, the patriarchy, the idea that men are toxic and all of that. But as I say, I think it would be much healthier if we focus on people like Jordan Peterson and let them be at the front of that than people like Andrew Tate and Milo Yiannopoulos.
Excellent. So, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about trigonometry now, because what I've noticed about what you two do really well on that show is although you are, opinionated and you do put your view forward, or you will openly disagree, you do allow room for the guest to talk. And it seems more important to you, in my mind, especially, to get their opinions on record. That seems to be what the goal is. And I just wanted to ask you about that approach. Is that a conscious decision? Is that something you have to really try to do, to bite your tongue sometime? How do you set out to have these discussions?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I'm glad you feel that way, because that is the point of trigonometry. In order, you know, I always think about the way that we approach every interview, the way we design the set, the way that everything is done is in order to make the guest the centerpiece of their attention. We're just there to facilitate that process. It's not about us. You know, I think you know, when we started in 2018, it was kind of a peak for this like shouty TV stuff where people get 2 minutes to express their point of view. And we just felt like a longer form thing where people get a chance to express their opinion, whether we agree with them or not, or whether our audience agree with them or not, is really important. But then as you develop also, you know, I sometimes disagree with guests because I disagree. And sometimes I play devil's advocate because I'm just trying to explore the argument that they're making to its logical conclusion. So I think, and it's really not that hard in terms of biting my tongue or anything, because I hope that's kind of how I am in person anyway. Like if you and I go for a pint and start talking about an issue, that's how I'd be talking with you. And I think that's one of the reasons most people enjoy the show, because they don't feel that it's a scripted, super structured, whatever. It's just people having a conversation and going where it takes them. And I think you know, it's important to have those conversations in that way, because as you know, I've done a bunch of TV, and you just don't get any time to say anything, you know, significant, really. And I think it's a big problem, and you can't really get any significant progress or argument made in that kind of time with the feeling that you're about to be interrupted all the time. So we are one of a bunch of people who've really taken that and run with it, and thankfully, you know, the reward's been there.
Certainly, and you seem to have like a broad range of guests from all political persuasions. Is there anything you'd sort of draw the line on? Would you have a discussion with an avowed neo-Nazi, for instance, on the show if you haven't already?
If we haven't already, there's a nice little dig. No, well, the thing with us is we're not really a debate show.
Yeah,
So we don't tend to get people on in order to have a robust argument with them. And so it makes it difficult to get more of the more extreme people on, because you feel like you'd really have to challenge a lot of what they said.
yeah.
Otherwise, you're sort of just like, you're getting a guy on who's a Nazi to like promote Nazism. It's not really what we started the show to do. So the line is kind of, I mean, there's no exact line. We just kind of go, do we want this person on? Do we think they'd be an interesting guest? Do we think that's something that would be interesting for us? First and foremost, really, trigonometry is just, it started out basically as two idiot comedians who wanted to find out what's going on in the world, and educate themselves. And that's the process, really. We're constantly trying to educate ourselves through the guests that we have on. And hopefully in the process, our audience gets to come on that journey as well.
Excellent. Well, one of your, I would imagine one of your most inflammatory episodes in recent memory was your discussion with Sam Harris, and I'm a big admirer of Sam Harris. I consider him a bit of a pal, and I appreciate the interview. I thought it was very interesting, challenging. There's a few things in there I didn't agree with Sam, which is always good. It's one of the reasons I like to read and consume his content. But I do feel that he probably didn't come off particularly well in certain clipped parts of the show. And I just wondered if you had any thought looking back on that, whether or not perhaps people treated him unfairly due to some of his things being taken out of context.
Well, it's a difficult one because we didn't clip that part of the interview that went super viral. It wasn't us that did it. However, I don't agree that it was taken out of context. I thought that it communicated exactly what he said in the room on the day. And when he walked out of that interview, like you, I'm a big fan of his, and I was sad to see him leave Twitter and all the rest of it. I don't have any ill will towards him, but I did think that what he said about Hunter Biden's laptop and how little he would, he cared about that issue, to put it very mildly. I thought it was out of line, and I did think that it was, he was pretty extreme. And also the other thing is, most people didn't see this part of the interview, but on our locals behind the paywall, we also talked with him about COVID and masking and vaccines and mandates. And I actually thought that part of the interview was probably even more extreme from his side, in terms of how much I personally disagreed with it, because there was a sort of like, you must be made to do whatever is in the interest of the greater good type of approach. And it's similar to the conversation about the Hunter Biden laptop, because it's like the ends justify the means. There are some issues with that approach. I think we can all agree. So, look, I think I very strongly disagree with what Sam said. But equally, it doesn't mean that I don't respect him. And I think, like with you, he was a big part of my intellectual journey over the last 5-6 years. He was there for me more at the beginning than the end, to be honest. He's not someone I followed as closely in recent years. But I just think it's important that people have the opportunity to say what they think. In his case, he got a lot of pushback over it. But it is what he thinks. I don't think he misspoke or anything like that. That's what he thinks. And he did a whole nother podcast in which he explained what he meant. And it was pretty much what he said, in my opinion. And yeah, I think that's kind of what we do. We let people talk, and sometimes people say what they say.
Yeah, I'd recommend anyone watching and listening to go and check out that episode and make up your own mind, because I think I'd be awful at trying to steel man Sam Harris. He's quite a deep thinker. But yeah, I found myself disagreeing with some of his stances in terms of, Twitter bans, the idea of suppressing information that might be integral to an election, things like that. But it's weird because I can sort of understand his arguments at the same time. So I kind of still gravitate towards his words in that respect. I can't not waste the opportunity actually to ask you about Ukraine and Russia. And I imagine for someone of your background, it must be incredibly frustrating to see people become overnight experts on Ukrainian and Russian conflict and history. There's no shortage of that in the UK in terms of commentators. And I suppose if you can summarize it in any way, what are the things that frustrate you the most? What are some of the biggest mistakes you see being made about this conflict from people who are well, pretty ignorant on the subject?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. I do get frustrated by it. One of my New Year's resolutions is not to go after people individually, because I spend a lot of time doing that otherwise, because I did get very annoyed about it. I think that, there are portions of the I mean, the thing that bugs me the most, I suppose, is that there are people who call themselves quote unquote anti-war, whose entire position is that we should basically let Vladimir Putin take over Ukraine. It doesn't seem to. I mean, that doesn't seem to me to be anti-war. And on the left, in particular, I mean, on the right, there is a portion of these people who've gone off the deep end because they're sort of stuck in this teenage oppositional defiance disorder mentality, whereby whatever the mainstream media says, the opposite of that must be true. And so
Yeah.
if the BBC printed that gravity is real, these people will jump out a window just to prove a point, But on the left, they also call themselves anti-imperialist, which I find quite interesting, because Vladimir Putin's attempt to rebuild the Russian Empire is exactly what's happening. So if you're anti-imperialist, you should be opposing Vladimir Putin's invasion and encouraging and supporting the Ukrainians. So I think that's a frustration of mine. But look, the reality is, I think in this country, we can be very proud, actually, of the support we've provided to Ukraine. I think the vast majority of our politicians and the public have been very supportive. I mean, just for example, on trigonometry, we did one live stream, a regular live stream on one night. We raised 55 grand.
Wow.
Just for Ukrainian charities in one night. And so and likewise, if you speak to people in Ukraine, which I do all the time, they can't express enough how grateful they are to Britain and to British people as individuals for providing help, both non-military assistance, but also actually helping them defend their country. So I think we can be very, very, very proud as British people and in Britain of the contribution that we've made in helping them defend themselves.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, is there a little bit of apathy setting in here in terms of this particular conflict now? It appears to me to be getting less news column inches. People don't seem to be talking about it as much.
Yeah, I think what's happened is the way it ebbs and flows depending on what's happening in the actual. We've been in a period of stalemate for a couple of months. You will remember that there was a big news explosion a couple of months ago when the Ukrainians managed to retake a lot of territory, and the thing shot up the agenda again. And then once you get a stalemate where neither side is making huge amounts of progress, then it kind of goes off the radar a bit, which I think is quite natural, to be honest. But Britain continues to provide a lot of support. The United States is actually ramping up a lot of the support. Other Ukrainian allies are also doing that. So I think maybe in the news media, but in terms of the help that we're providing, it hasn't tapered off at all. In fact, we're providing more and more as time goes on. So I think, as I say, we can be very, very satisfied with how we've approached it in this country.
Has social media made big news stories or big events like this just a complete minefield of conspiracy now? Is it possible to have a huge event now without it turning into a mass conspiracy fest online?
I don't think it is, and it's an interesting thing that you see happening online. I don't know if you remember, but if you are on Twitter like me, there was a period a few months ago prior to Elon Musk taking over Twitter, where like Elon Musk and everyone else was like obsessively trying to solve the nuclear threat of the Russian Do you remember this period there?
Yes,
Everyone was going on about it. And then Elon Musk bought Twitter, and he obviously had something else to do with his time. And suddenly the nuclear threat disappeared overnight and no one's talking about it anymore. And I think you kind of see that social media is just this big distraction machine that isn't really necessarily correlated with what's happening in the real world and what's happening on the ground. Because if the nuclear threat was a big deal back then it hasn't reduced in scale since. In fact, you'd argue it's ramped up because Russia has been pushed back and the conflict goes on, etc. But no one's talking about it. And I think that just tells you that, social media is almost like a virtual world of its own, that is important because it does have a bearing on the real world. But I think we sometimes confuse the virtual world for the real one, and there is still, thank God, a difference.
Yeah, for sure. It kind of reminds me a little bit of when North Korea were carrying out, regular weekly missile tests, and there was round the wall coverage on the news about, he's brought the meal out, the missile out, he's took it back
Mm.
again, he's testing, it's a big threat, and then ISIS happened, and we completely lost interest in North Korea.
Right.
So, just there are all these conspiracies. I mean, you've alluded to them before about not trusting the mainstream media, but it's hard to not accept that in some way they do
Oh,
decide what we should pay attention to.
well, 100%, man. And look, I had a viral thread that we made into a video and then later an article, and it's one of the chapters in my book talking about why people are vaccine hesitant. And I lay a lot of the blame at the mainstream media's feet, because if you keep lying to people over and over and over and over and over in many different contexts, then eventually they're going to start to ask questions. But I think the challenge for all of us is to go, well, the idea that everything, the meme online is, I support the current thing, right?
Hmm.
I think there's a portion of society now that is, I oppose the current thing. And I think if you've got an IQ over 80, what you should be doing is going, what is actually true?
Yeah.
That kind of seems to me to be the important thing, right? And that can be difficult, and you're probably not going to be able to get the accurate information on every issue. And this is one of the other things that people have forgotten, is like, it's okay not to have a strongly held opinion about everything. There could be quite a lot of things you genuinely don't know about, and you could say, well, I don't know. And one of the problems of social media is we're all disincentivized from doing that.
Yeah, sometimes I almost admire the audacity of people to wade headfirst into a situation or topic they have no clue on whatsoever. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about your book. And it's you are an immigrant. It's from the perspective of an immigrant, and your love for the West. What kind of things do you sort of pick out in terms of Western civilization that you find particularly valuable?
Yeah, well, the book is called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Thankfully, it was a Sunday Times bestseller in the first week that it came out, so it resonated with people. I mean, I talk about a lot of the things that make the West great. I also talk about some of the threats to those things. I talk about where political correctness comes from, because most people have no idea that it actually originated in the Soviet Union. That's where it comes from. Had nothing ever to do with avoiding offending people or being sensitive to people's feelings or anything like that. It was a purely political tool. But, alluding to that, free speech is obviously a huge thing. People won't know this, but in Russia, when the conflict broke out, when Russia invaded, people went out into the street to protest about it with placards, and they were arrested. So the next day, people went out into the street with no placard, but they held up an imaginary placard, and they were arrested, right? And I think that just people in the West, in my experience, don't really understand how lucky and privileged we are to have all the opportunities, the freedoms, the human rights, all of those things, and economic opportunities, obviously. And so the main reason I wrote the book really is I wanted to remind people in the West how fortunate we are to have what we have, and that you're going to get demagogues from left and right coming along and sort of promising to revolutionize everything and change it overnight. Actually, what we've got is pretty good. Let's not mess with the program too much. And let's, gradual improvement, I think, is the way that we should pursue things. And the reason I think, the book is timely is there's quite a lot of people now who think that the only solution to anything is to overthrow the whole system and start from scratch. And I come from a society that did that, and I know about other societies that did that. Doesn't usually end that well.
For sure. I mean, I'm not sure people appreciate as well that a lot of the values and things that the West has are not really the norm globally, and
Hmm.
it's not something that is fixed like a save point in a video game. These things can be dialed back. I mean, how concerned are you in terms of how speech laws are heading in the UK? It even seems that the Tories are trying to introduce like the digital harms bill, for instance, to try and regulate what we can say and do online.
Yeah, it's a huge threat, and it just has to be opposed with every fiber of our being, because if you think about historically and take a bigger picture view, look around and look at societies where what you are allowed to say is heavily restricted, where comedians are routinely investigated for jokes that they make, as now happens in the UK. Those are not generally societies in which you choose to live in, and there's not times in history where you generally choose to live in. So the restriction of speech is a symptom of authoritarianism. And anytime, any place that happens, you have to fight back against it, because people don't understand that it's not just about freedom of speech, because in order to think, you have to speak. And if I have an idea, I have to say it out loud and then hear what you have to say about it, and then I may go, well, actually, it was a crazy idea, but I've got this little piece as a result of our discussion. Whereas if we're not allowed to say what we think, then we're not allowed to think for ourselves, essentially. And so it's not just a restriction of what you think, it's also a restriction of it's not a restriction of what you say, it's also a restriction of what other people are allowed to hear. And most important of all, of what you actually get to think in your head, which seems to me to be quite important. And by the way, it's not an abstract thing. I mean, if you think about the fact that the West has been incredibly scientifically successful in terms of making technological progress, scientific advances, all of that is a product of the fact that, within science, until recently, people were allowed to debate any issue and to come up with theories and test them out in reality. Now we've forgotten what a woman is, so we're regressing in
Well,
some way.
before we go down that particular rabbit hole, I think unfortunately we have run out of time, Konstantin. But it's been a pleasure to catch up with you, and I'm sure all of the links to trigonometry in your book have been put in the comments so people can find it. But yeah, thank you very much. It's been nice to speak to you.
Thanks for having me, mate. Good to see you again.
You too. Take care.